Imagine waking up one morning to find that the world's second superpower, armed with thousands of nuclear warheads and ruling over nearly 300 million people, had simply vanished. No Great War, no foreign invasion, just gone. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union, the empire that once terrified the West, collapsed almost overnight. But this wasn't some random accident. It was the result of decades of failed policies, crushing stagnation, shocking disasters, and political betrayal that even its own leaders couldn't contain. What exactly happened inside the Kremlin's walls, and how did one of history's most powerful empires implode from within? After Stalin's death, when Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union was left in shock. For decades, his brutal purges and iron-fisted rule had created a climate of fear so deep that even his closest allies weren't sure what came next. His likely successor, Lavrenti Beria, the dreaded head of the secret police, seemed poised to take control. But in a dramatic twist, other party leaders moved first. Beria was swiftly arrested and executed, proving that in Soviet politics, survival was always a deadly game. Into this chaos stepped Nikita Khrushchev, a man few expected to rise to the top. Instead of ruling through sheer terror like Stalin, he tried a different path, demoting rivals instead of killing them, and even taking the bold step of denouncing Stalin himself in what became known as the secret speech. For the first time, Soviet citizens heard a leader admit that Stalin's cult of personality and violent repression had gone too far. This moment marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, a promise that the Soviet Union could change. But while Khrushchev wanted reform, he also inherited a nation still haunted by gulags, corruption, and fear. And soon his risky decisions would send shockwaves across the world. Khrushchev's gambles. Khrushchev wanted to prove that the Soviet Union could thrive without Stalin's shadow. His first gamble was agriculture. Obsessed with corn, he launched the Virgin Lands campaign, plowing up vast stretches of land to grow crops. At first, the harvests looked promising, but one bad season was enough to expose the plan's weakness. Farms collapsed, food shortages worsened, and Khrushchev's grand vision started to look like a joke. Yet while his farming schemes failed, Soviet rockets soared. In 1957, the USSR shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. These achievements weren't just about exploration. They were a warning that Soviet missiles could now reach the United States. But Khrushchev's boldest gamble nearly brought the world to nuclear war. In 1962, he placed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. For 13 days, the world held its breath as U.S. and Soviet forces stood on the brink of Armageddon. In the end, Khrushchev backed down, removing the missiles in exchange for a quiet U.S. withdrawal of its own weapons in Europe. Publicly, it looked like he had lost. His image as a strong leader was shattered, and by 1964, his rivals forced him into retirement. Khrushchev's fall left the Soviet Union with a dangerous question. If reform and bold gambles had failed, what path would the next leader take? Brezhnev's era, stability or stagnation? When Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev in 1964, he promised stability. And for a while, it looked like he delivered. No more wild agricultural experiments, no reckless missile gambles. Instead, Brezhnev ruled with caution, consulting party elites and keeping the Soviet machine grinding forward. But beneath this calm exterior, the system was slowly suffocating. The economy began to stagnate. Prices were fixed by the government. Corruption was everywhere, and innovation was stifled. Factories produced goods nobody wanted, while grocery store shelves sat half empty. Ordinary citizens grew weary of waiting in endless lines for basic necessities. Abroad, Brezhnev projected strength with the Brezhnev Doctrine, the promise that the USSR would crush any attempt at reform in its satellite states. In 1968, when Czechoslovakia experimented with loosening censorship, Soviet tanks rolled in and crushed the Prague Spring. It was a chilling reminder. Moscow would not allow freedom to spread in Eastern Europe. But the cost of this stability was enormous. Corruption flourished, dissent was silenced, and the Soviet Union poured staggering sums into the military to keep up with the United States. By 1979, Brezhnev made his most disastrous move, invading Afghanistan to support a failing communist government. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a bloody 10-year quagmire, the Soviet Vietnam. By the time Brezhnev died in 1982, the USSR was exhausted, its economy was flatlining, its global image was battered, and its people had lost faith in promises of a better future. The stage was set for the next leader, but nobody could predict just how explosive his reforms would be. Gorbachev's reforms. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was running on fumes. The economy was stagnant, the war in Afghanistan was bleeding resources, and its leaders kept dying in office. When Mikhail Gorbachev, a younger and more energetic figure, took power in 1985, many saw him as the last hope to revive the crumbling empire. Gorbachev's answer came in three bold reforms. First, perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to modernize the economy by allowing limited market practices. Second, glasnost, meaning openness, promised new transparency and freedom of speech. And third, democratization, a shocking idea for a one-party state, introduced real elections where non-communists could compete. But instead of strengthening the Soviet Union, these reforms unleashed forces Gorbachev could no longer control. Glasnost exposed the failures that had long been hidden: food shortages, corruption, environmental disasters, and decades of lies. In 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, the government tried to cover it up. But word spread, and Soviet citizens were outraged that their own leaders had kept silent about a disaster poisoning their people. Perestroika, meanwhile, failed to fix the economy. Instead, shortages grew worse, inflation soared, and ordinary citizens felt the pain of change without the benefits. And democratization, that gave voice to critics who openly challenged the Communist Party itself. Across the USSR, people began asking, if the system was this broken, why not get rid of it altogether? For the first time in its history, the Soviet Union faced open dissent, not just from its enemies abroad, but from its own citizens at home. And the cracks were about to spread far beyond Moscow. The Warsaw Pact unravels. By 1989, the consequences of Gorbachev's reforms were spilling beyond Soviet borders. For decades, Moscow had ruled Eastern Europe with an iron grip through the Warsaw Pact, crushing uprisings whenever they appeared. But now, with glasnost and democratization at home, Gorbachev stunned the world by refusing to use force to hold his allies in line. One by one, communist regimes across Eastern Europe began to collapse. In Poland, free elections swept the Solidarity movement into power. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened, creating the first crack in the Iron Curtain. In East Germany, protests swelled until the Berlin Wall itself, long the symbol of communist strength, was torn down in November 1989. Across Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, communist governments fell in rapid succession. Within months, the Warsaw Pact, once the proud military alliance that countered NATO, was little more than a memory. For the Soviet Union, this was a humiliation. For the people living in Moscow, Kiev, and across the USSR, it was a wake-up call. If Eastern Europe could break free, what was stopping the republics inside the Soviet Union from demanding the same? Nationalism inside the USSR. As Eastern Europe slipped away, pressure inside the Soviet Union itself exploded. For decades, the USSR had held together dozens of republics: Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Georgians, and many more under one flag. But now, with glasnost giving people a voice, and Gorbachev unwilling to crush dissent with force, old national identities surged back to the surface. In March 1990, Lithuania became the first republic to declare independence, openly defying Moscow. Soon after, Latvia and Estonia followed. Across the Union, nationalist movements gained strength, with citizens demanding sovereignty, elections, and freedom from the Kremlin's control. At the same time, faith in communism collapsed. Economic reforms had failed, stores were empty, and people no longer trusted a government that had promised equality but delivered only corruption and shortages. For many, independence wasn't just about nationalism, it was about survival. The more Gorbachev tried to hold the USSR together with reforms, the faster it unraveled. And as the republics pulled away, a new figure was rising in Russia itself, someone who would soon eclipse Gorbachev and take the Soviet collapse into his own hands. Yeltsin versus Gorbachev. While Gorbachev fought to reform and preserve the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin was moving in a very different direction. Once a rising star in the Communist Party, Yeltsin broke away in spectacular fashion. In 1990, he quit the party altogether, blasting its corruption and failures. Ordinary Russians, frustrated with empty shelves and endless promises, saw him as a bold alternative. In June 1991, Yeltsin won Russia's first ever presidential election, becoming the face of a new era. For the first time, a Soviet republic had a leader directly chosen by its people, not the Communist Party. His victory was a direct challenge to Gorbachev's authority and to the system itself. The showdown came in August of that year, when hardline communists launched a coup to overthrow Gorbachev and restore the old order. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and for a moment it seemed the Soviet Union might return to its iron-fisted past. But in a scene that stunned the world, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament, calling on citizens to resist. Crowds rallied to his side, and within days, the coup collapsed. In that moment, Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, became the hero of the people. The Communist Party was discredited, its power shattered, and the Soviet Union, already crumbling, was now racing toward its final days. The final collapse. After the failed coup of August 1991, the Soviet Union unraveled at lightning speed. Republic after republic declared independence, determined never again to be ruled from Moscow. By December, even Ukraine, the second-largest Soviet republic, voted overwhelmingly to break away. Without Ukraine, the USSR was finished. On December 8, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secret and signed the Belavasia Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved, and replacing it with a loose alliance called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Just weeks later, on December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The next day, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place stood the Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, beginning a turbulent new era of capitalism and uncertainty. After nearly 70 years, the world's largest communist state had collapsed, not with a nuclear war, but with a quiet surrender to its own failures. The empire that once stretched across 11 time zones was gone, leaving behind 15 independent nations, a broken economy, and a question that still lingers today. How could a superpower so powerful fall so fast? The fall of the Soviet Union wasn't the result of a single mistake. It was the slow unraveling of a system that could no longer support itself. From Khrushchev's risky gambles to Brezhnev's stagnation, from the burden of Afghanistan to Gorbachev's reforms that spun out of control, every decision pulled one more thread from the fabric of the empire. By 1991, the world's largest communist state had collapsed, not in a blaze of war, but in a quiet surrender to its own contradictions. For 70 years, the USSR had stood as a symbol of power, ideology, and fear. Yet in the end, it proved that no empire, no matter how vast, can survive when its foundation is cracked from within. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse shows us how even the most powerful systems can crumble when corruption, stagnation, and unchecked power collide. History doesn't just belong to the past. It shapes the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of history. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think the USSR was doomed from the start? Or could it have been saved if Gorbachev had taken a different path? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them.